Welcome to Poets House live streaming. My name is Paulo Javier, poet and program director of Poets House, and we are broadcasting tonight from Lenape Haking, specifically the unceded territory of the Rockaway, Canarsie, Matinacock, and Maspeth peoples, otherwise prevalently known as Queens County, New York City. Tonight marks the fourth of our online series of live streamed events, and I'm so pleased to be inaugurating our Poetry and Spirituality series with a focus on the Lotus Sutra. Among the most popular and influential of the great Mahayana Sutras, the basis on which the Tiantai, Tendai, Khyentse, and Nichiren schools of Buddhism were established, and for many of its adherents, the sutra that contains the final teaching of Shakyamuni. I am joined tonight by a terrific panel. Donald Lopez, author of the terrific book, The Lotus Sutra, a biography, and poets Jennifer Kwan Dobbs and Thomas Fink. Each of them will present on the Lotus Sutra and maybe read from it and their own poetry, followed by a discussion that I will moderate. Our first presenter is Donald Lopez. Professor Lopez is the Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan. He is the author, translator, and editor of numerous works in the field of Buddhist studies on topics ranging from Buddhist philosophy to Buddhism and science, including recently Two Buddhas Seated Side by Side, a guide to the Lotus Sutra, which was published with Jacqueline Stone, as well as the Lotus Sutra, a biography, as part of Princeton University's Lives of Great Books series. In 2008, Professor Lopez was the first scholar of Buddhism to deliver the Terry Lectures at Yale. In 2014, the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism, which he edited with Robert Buswell, was awarded the Dartmouth Medal for Best Reference Work of the Year. I'm so pleased and honored to be welcoming Donald to our event tonight. Donald?
Thank you, Paolo. The Lotus Sutra is arguably the most influential of all Buddhist texts. It's been translated into many languages many times. It's inspired all manner of Buddhist works, both textual and artistic. It provided the foundation for one major school of Chinese Buddhism and two major schools of Japanese Buddhism. Many books and hundreds of academic articles have been written about it. Entire university courses have been devoted to it. It's my task to tell you something about the Lotus Sutra and its poetry in 10 minutes. So let's begin. The Lotus Sutra is the English title of an Indian Buddhist text. In fact, it's one of only 3 Buddhist sutras to be well known by an English title, the others being the Diamond Sutra and the Heart Sutra. The Lotus Sutra was composed in Sanskrit, where its title is Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, the sutra on the white lotus of the true Dharma, with Dharma here referring to the teaching of the Buddha. The word sutra, which often means aphorism in Sanskrit, here means something like discourse. In Buddhism, the term sutra means a teaching by the Buddha. In addition to its huge fame and influence in Asia, especially in China, Korea, and Japan, the Lotus Sutra has its own interesting history in the West. It was the first Buddhist sutra to be translated from Sanskrit into a European language, into French by Eugène Burnouf in 1852. The Lotus Sutra also figures in the American Encounter with Buddhism. Prior to publishing the full translation, Burnouf had published a translation of the 5th chapter in 1843. The next year, this chapter was translated from French into English and published in Ralph Waldo Emerson's journal, The Dial. It was long thought that to have been translated from the French by Thoreau, but in fact it was translated by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, a pioneer in children's education and the sister-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne. For reasons we can discuss later, Buddhist texts are notoriously difficult to date. Based on a variety of historical and textual factors, scholars speculate that the Lotus Sutra evolved over the course of 3 centuries, with the first versions appearing around 100 BCE, and the text reaching its present form around 200 of the Common Era. Those who know something about the life of the Buddha might feel perplexed at this point. Although there is still little consensus about the dates of the Buddha, the latest date of his death is placed around 400 BCE. If the Lotus Sutra is the teaching of the Buddha, how is it that scholars speculate that it was composed centuries after his passage into nirvana? The Lotus Sutra is perhaps the most famous of the Mahayana sutras, sutras of what is called the Great Vehicle. texts that began to be composed about 300 years after the Buddha's death, texts that provided new visions of the Buddha's path and new visions of the Buddha. All authority in Buddhism must derive ultimately from the Buddha himself, and thus the words of these texts, written on palm leaves long after his death, are placed in the mouth of the Buddha. There are many clues in the Lotus Sutra to suggest that its authors were well aware of its belatedness. But that's another conversation. We're here tonight to talk about the poetry. In the substantial scholarship on the Lotus Sutra, little is said about its poetry as poetry. What we see instead is scholarship on poetry inspired by the Lotus, especially in Japan. There are many reasons why this sutra has inspired so much poetry. Indeed, that could be the topic of another conversation. We can mention, however, its 7 parables, there are 8 in the Sanskrit version, and its many dramatic scenes, including a massive stupa rising out of the earth and an 8-year-old dragon princess becoming a Buddha in the blink of an eye. But the Lotus Sutra does contain poetry, quite a lot of poetry. Scholars of Buddhism, however, are less interested in the meter and the imagery, and more interested in the unusual role that it plays in the text. It's quite common for a Buddhist sutra to be written completely in verse, or for poetry to be interspersed among the prose. The Lotus Sutra is different. The first part of a chapter will be in prose, at the end of which the text will say, quote, "Thereupon the Buddha, wanting to elaborate on the meaning of this further, spoke these verses." At that point, the Buddha then essentially repeats in verse what he has just said in prose. The word translated as verse is gatha in Sanskrit, sometimes translated as song. So it seems that in each chapter, the Buddha suddenly burst into song. This is not, however, Lotus Sutra, the musical. In 1844, Eugène Burnouf wrote about the importance of translating Buddhist texts from their original language, not from another Asian translation. That is, if a Buddhist text was composed in Sanskrit and the text is extant, it should be translated from the Sanskrit, not from its Chinese or Tibetan translation. The example that Burnouf gave is the poetry of the Lotus Sutra. Because it is only in the Sanskrit that one can see that the prose sections and the verse sections are almost in different languages, we might say in different dialects. To be more precise, the prose section is in standard Sanskrit, while the verse contains many elements of vernaculars that form a language that scholars have dubbed Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. This repetition of the content of the chapter, first in classical prose and second in vernacular verse, is very unusual in a Buddhist text. There is much speculation as to why this is the case. One theory holds that the verse is the original text, composed in the vernacular and perhaps originally preserved orally, with the prose added later, as many changes were made to the text over the centuries. It's clear, for example, that the Lotus Sutra is supposed to end with chapter 22, and yet the sutra as we have it today has 28 chapters. The prose and poetry differ in other ways. In their verse form, the inspiring passages are more soul-stirring, and the frightening passages are more blood-chilling. So let me conclude my comments by reading an example of a scary part. This comes from chapter 3, where we find the famous parable of the burning house, in which a father uses a ruse to convince his children, absorbed in their games, to escape from the fire that is consuming his home. I chose this passage for 2 reasons. First, because it was a favorite of Flaubert, who knew it from Burnouf's French translation. And second, because it is unlike what one might expect to find in a Buddhist text. Then the Buddha, wanting to elaborate on the meaning of this again, spoke these verses. Suppose there were an affluent man who had a and this house was very old, on the verge of collapsing. The halls were extremely dangerous, the pillar bases rotten and disintegrating, the beams and framework dangerously tilted, and the stairways were falling apart. The fences and walls were cracked, the plaster was peeling off, the thatched roof was falling down, the rafters and eaves were coming apart, the partitions were everywhere askew, and the whole place was covered with filth. 500 people lived there, and moving around helter-skelter were kites, owls, hawks, eagles, crows, magpies, doves, pigeons, lizards, snakes, vipers, scorpions, centipedes, millipedes, newts, myriapods, ferrets, badgers, mice, rats, and other harmful creatures. It was filled with stench, and there were places overflowing with excrement. All kinds of bugs had gathered there. There were foxes, wolves, and vermin, devouring, trampling, and gnawing on corpses, scattering bones and flesh about, and a pack of dogs, forcing each other out of the way, rushed to the spot. Frightened and exhausted from hunger, they were searching everywhere for food, fighting among themselves, snatching at food, biting, snarling, and barking at each other. This house was terrifying. It is indeed a frightening scene, but we must remember that the Buddha explains that the burning house is samsara, the world in which we live. Paulo, back to you.
Thank you so much, Donald. What a great welcome to our conversation later, and I can't wait to have that conversation with everybody. Our next presenter is Jennifer Kwan Dobbs, who is the author of 2 poetry collections, Paper Pavilion and Interrogation Room, mentioned in the New York Times and praised by World Literature Today for, quote, a vigorous restlessness, end quote. Dobbs has received the Association of Asian American Studies Book Award for Poetry, a Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship, and a Minnesota State Arts Board Artist Initiative Grant. A poetry editor at the journal Agni, Dobbs is currently an associate professor of creative writing at St. Olaf College and a guest lecturer at Universitat Bielefeld. Great to have you here tonight, Jennifer.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you to Poets House. It's an honor to be in conversation with Donald Lopez and to reconnect with the inimitable Thomas Spink, I once taught alongside while English department faculty at CUNY LaGuardia. The Lotus Sutra entered my life in 1999 when I began practicing Nichiren Buddhism while a graduate student pursuing an MFA in poetry at the University of Pittsburgh. During this time, I became a member of Soka Gakkai and began chanting Daimoku and learning Gongyo with the support of my friend and mentor, Sheila Carter-Jones, who is also the author of the award-winning poetry chapbook, 3 Birds Deep. That same year, I also contacted my adoption agency to begin a birth search for my Korean family, enrolled in a Korean language class at the university, and began studying with Professor Marianne Novi, who co-founded the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture. In the Nichiren Buddhist liturgy of Soka Gakkai, Gongyo consists of 2 excerpts from the Lotus Sutra's 2nd chapter on expedient means and 16th chapter on the lifespan of Thus Come One. It ends with lines from the 16th chapter's poem. At all times I think to myself, how can I cause living beings to gain entry into the unsurpassed way and quickly acquire Buddha? Learning how to chant Daimoku and Gongyo required a way of breathing, a line of vibration that broke my monolingual mouth and opened my hearing in ways that were at first incredibly visceral, even uncomfortable to me. It may be difficult to remember that 21 years ago, the internet was not yet a constant fixture in everyday life. There were no YouTube or Instagram how-to videos. I learned Daimoku and Gongyo through community, in particular with the encouragement and support of Sheila and our friend Mikyung. And as I developed a consistent practice, I became acutely aware of how English, the language of my assimilation through intercountry adoption, had organized my senses and created an adoptee body based on the illusion of a dead Korean past. My Korean family was not in the past, and I could not confirm their deaths. They could be alive right now. Right now is the present tense. My Korean parents and I are breathing in this moment together, cut off from each other's realities. The cutting is a construct. Its ballast is English. I was beginning to refuse a teleological understanding of the material world and to lean into ideas of cause and effect. The weight of English was beginning to detach. When I chanted, I slowly rocked back and forth. But I was failing my Korean language class while gaining confidence in reciting the Nichiren Buddhist liturgy in kanji, written in kanji. When I told my Korean professor that I planned to withdraw, she asked me how I would speak with my mother if we reunited. I could not answer her. Perhaps I was trading one assimilation for another that, at the time, I did not have the historical knowledge to understand. In the early 20th century, the Nichiren school, backed by the Tokyo government, sought to absorb and subsume Korean colonization. But beyond cultural authenticity or nationalist belonging, I just couldn't bear the pain of my senses and sense of self rearranging so quickly. Chanting Daimoku and Gongyo and reading the Lotus Sutra in English translation had intensified my sense of empathy. I was beginning to layer time in my poems to get at the simultaneity that the sutra had led me to comprehend. For the first time in my writing, I imagined my Korean family breathing with me. Their absence was a presence that I could write around. I could bring feeling and compassion to the shape of their absence in my life, and to the shape of my absence in theirs. In the late 1990s, so much of Asian American lyric poetry focused on intergenerational memory. And as an adopted person, I was grateful to that poetry, but could not write it. I struggled with whether I was recognizable as an Asian American on the page. And so I renamed myself Jennifer Kwan Dobbs in order to inhabit Kwonyoung Mi, my name on my Korean birth registry. And I turned to Korean poetry and translation to get closer to a tone, a feeling, an energy that I could hold in my body and transmit onto paper. Searching the internet via dial-up, America Online, I stumbled across Brother Anthony of Taizé's blog on Korean 20th century poetry. Yet it was the poet Kim Ki-taek who introduced me to the work of Manhye Han-yong-un, a Buddhist monk, signatory of the Korean Declaration of Independence, and a poet. Han wrote The Silence of My Love, a collection of poems that record his awakening to the genuine meaning of love in the midst of anti-colonial struggle. In 2011, when I reunited with my Korean mother and father, who never married, I carried Han's poems with me. This line especially entered my consciousness. Don't be suspicious of me just because I'm far away from you. My reunion opened gaps in my story that I didn't even know existed and threatened to rupture the Asian American body that I had struggled to create. I learned that Kwonyoung Mi is not my name. It's a placeholder assigned to me by the adoption agency in order to file paperwork. I also learned that my mother is a Christian and my father is a Buddhist. Again, I felt my senses rearrange, my sense of self shifting. While visiting a Buddhist temple in Gangwon-do with my appa, unable to speak in Korean in the early years of our reunion, I leaned into an emerging openness between us, an understanding around the mouth, a quiet compassion for each other's strangeness. In a restaurant in Seoul, my father cut the meat off soup bones so that I could eat, gave me a set of Buddhist prayer beads, and pointed at monks in the subway station. Smiling, he said, "Sinin." Sometimes he accidentally called me by my half-sister's name, and every time he sighed or apologized with his eyes and continued to try to love me. I want to read a poem from Paper Pavilion, a collection I began writing while living in Pittsburgh before I traveled to Korea, before I reunited with my Korean family. Its opening poem enacts the poetics that I'm trying to describe here. A small gift. Kusang, guide me as a tender brother, scrupulous with pathways to the Han that flows above the sky. Below hanging baskets of ivy and the shadow of tenements, I spend my light counting sorrows, the ants haul across railings. Let me listen to your chest's easy crests, falling and rising to take your shirt's hem. Let me collect the button and thread about to unravel. I'll show you when you awaken how I shellacked them with oxblood for a pendant charm. And you will sternly correct me by touching my face as you would a mirror the river becomes an autumn morning. And you will say in Korean, something I'll feel without translation, run through me a current of sadness mixed with some joy. Perhaps similar to the poet Kusang, who I reference in my poem, I struggle with spiritual questions and am searching for a poetic vision that can resist the fragmentation of shattered histories. Currently, I'm no longer a member of Soka Gakkai or a practicing Buddhist. I remain, however, deeply grateful to the Lotus Sutra and consider it a pivotal influence on my poetry. Chanting Daimoku and Gongyo prepared me for translingualism in my poems that, even though a non-Korean reader may not understand my denotative meaning, transmit a decolonial experience of language. I just want to read a very quick excerpt from Urayama Ege, which is from my collection Interrogation Room. Urayama Ege. Urayama Ege 미안해요. 나는 지폐했습니다. 나는 아기처럼 말해요. 비하지 않고 언어했어. 배고파. 많이 먹고 싶어. I published this handwritten letter commissioned by the Asian American Literary Review for its special issue on mental health as a document that bears the marks of my struggle to decolonize my mouth and create a Korean body through language. I jokingly refer to this writing as Ibyeongsatori or adoptee dialect. By embracing this flawed language, I'm letting go of shame and summoning attention and care for an outlaw kinship with my Amma, who is an unwed mother. And I want to close with one final poem titled Yisang's Room, which references the great modernist Korean poet, his seminal work, The Wings, and ends with an image of possibility. So Yisang's Room. At this table, I pose as an illiterate draftsman. Tax collectors commissioned me for an imperial museum, but I design my name as a false frame, though marked by bureaucrats as an industrious example. There on rafters of bone, I inscribe an orange butterfly for the virtuous wives sickened by their husbands' seamen, pumped to Battleship Island, to motor coal cars. The messages the men carve, I want to go home, beloved, I miss you. Into the timbered shafts, shingle my roof against a red sun, and within its blaze I cut lengths of air for walls that a solitary prisoner released from Sonamun can dream inside. Here I no longer fear the tenure committee who prefers red lacquered bowls to story loss, or administrators who nail ordinances to my porch. Motherless, my words may be dismissed as experiments, or disappear inside a courtyard lake, or divide a pillared darkness into floating rooms in which monks and poets eat. The bronze latch slips and leaves blow through the gate. Now it's possible to speak in earnest of escape. Don't let disaster catch you, immobile and bereft. Failure is also a posture against. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Oh my, you mentioned Yisang, and that's a couple of programs that we can devote to unpacking Yisang. Thank you so much for the presentation. I can't wait to have our conversation shortly. My next and final presenter is Thomas Fink, who's published 11 books of poetry, most recently A Pageant for Every Addiction, which was written collaboratively with Maya D. Mason, and Hedge Fund Certainty, as well as 2 books of criticism, including A Different Sense of Power, Problems of Community in Late 20th Century U.S. Poetry. Tom has also edited anthologies, including Reading the Difficulties, Dialogues with Contemporary American Innovative Poetry, and his work has appeared in Best American Poetry, 2007, edited by David Lehman and Heather McHugh. His paintings hang in various collections. Tom is professor of English at CUNY LaGuardia. Folks, so happy to be introducing and welcoming Thomas Fink to our proceedings this evening. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Paolo. And it's really a pleasure to be here. For 46 years, twice a day, I've recited the 2nd and 16th chapter of Kumarajiva's Chinese translation of the Lotus Sutra and chanted Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Now, the verse section of the 16th chapter has an interesting meter with a strong incantatory effect, and its spondis create a real sense of power. There are, in each verse, in each line, 5 Chinese characters, or kanji, and there are 3 possibilities. One is 5 single syllables, umandarake, 2 spondis and an extra stressed syllable, and then 4 single syllables and 1 2-syllable unit, shujo shoyu raku. And notice that the raku, the 2-part syllable, the 2-syllable one, is said very quickly in the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese character. And then a third possibility are 3 single syllables and 2 2-syllable units. Gen, u, mes, fu, me. So 1 spondi, 1 trochee, 1 spondi, and an extra unstressed syllable. Now I'd like to talk about 2 of the parables that Donald Lopez mentioned. First, there's the parable of the jewel in the robe, which is in chapter 8 of the Lotus Sutra. I'll just very briefly summarize it rather than reading it. A poor man went to a rich friend's house, and while the poor guy was asleep, the rich friend took a priceless jewel and sewed it in the lining of the poor man's robe, then left. The poor man traveled widely and had a really rough time surviving, never thought things would improve. So one day, the friend met the poor man by chance and criticized him for not making use of the jewel. So finally, the poor man realizes that he has a priceless jewel in the lining of his coat, and he realizes his great fortune. Now, I believe that I'd like to find an interesting analogy of this parable with poetic production in terms of the experience of writer's block. A poet tries many strategies and nothing works, as though the answer is repressed in his unconscious or her unconscious. And I think often this is, even though the answer to the problem is there, it has to do with selective perception. It seems the poet is probably distracted by inessentials. For example, illusions about inspiration, rigid adherence to procedures or constraints, ideological prohibitions, or the desire to conform to popular modes of poetry to gain recognition rather than sticking with what's more important. So finally, in this case, out of the blue, the poet is suddenly back on track and now thinks, well, this should have been, this answer should have been obvious. So I think this is the situation of the poor man who should have felt around in his coat and didn't. Now, finally, I'd like to first read and then develop another analogy for another parable. Again, this is the verse section of the parable of the Phantom City and the treasure land. It's in chapter 7. Imagine a stretch of deep, poor road in a remote wasteland with fierce beasts, a scary, grassless, waterless terrain. A group of 10,000s wanted to cross, but the road stretched far, 500 yojanas. At this time, there was a leader, superbly knowing, endowed with wisdom, discernment, determination, able to save the imperiled from manifold hindrances. Weary, disheartened, the group told him, "We are exhausted and want to go back." The leader thought them pitiful. Why would they turn back and miss myriad rare treasures ahead? Then he devised an expedient means and marshaled his transcendental towers. He conjured up a great walled city, adorned its mansions with gardens and groves, flowing water channels, ponds, lakes, with double gates, tall towers, and pavilions. Having created this illusion, he comforted the group. Fear not, you may enter this city and refresh yourselves. When the travelers entered, all were overjoyed, imbued with ease and tranquility, remarking on their rescue. Seeing that they were rested, the leader assembled them, announced, "This is no more than a phantom city. I saw you were weary and wanted to turn back in mid-journey, so I used the power of expedient means to conjure this city momentarily. Now you must press forward diligently so that together you may reach the treasure realm." And in the explanation in the verse section that follows this, the Buddha says that he's using the power of expedient means to preach the three. Actually, two of those three vehicles are only a resting place for the traveler towards enlightenment, and enlightenment is in the third vehicle, which is really the only one true vehicle. Now, the analogy I've devised with the Phantom City parable has to do with a poet's development. In this analogy, the traveler in the group is the poet, the leader is the poet's environment, not a specific individual necessarily. And by environment, I mean the context of his or her life: aesthetic, academic, political, work-oriented, family, etc. The traveler's desire to turn back is comparable to the poet's struggle with self-doubt about writing, the idea of giving up poetry. The leader's creation of the Phantom City is a shift in some aspect or aspects of the environment, and the poet's new perceptions of the environment that create a change, that create an advantage for the poet. The traveler's refreshing stay in the Phantom City is the poet's success and refreshment in producing a body of work that she or he can validate, at least temporarily. Now then, the leader exposing the problem with the Phantom City is tantamount to a further shift in some aspects of the environment perceived by the poet, indicating that he or she is in a rut and needs to progress in poetic aim. So it's a dissatisfaction leading to a new challenge. And the individual traveling with the leader toward an enlightened destination is the poet working to reach a new level of poetry via a process of developing poetic strategies to adapt effectively to these new perceptions of the shifting environment. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Thomas, Jennifer, and Donald. Where do we even begin? I think maybe I'll start from where the idea for this program came for me. And as a poet who has been interested, of course, in poetry, but also poetry's interest in sacred texts and certainly Buddhism, I've always been struck by, here in the West, here in North America, certainly, the prevalence of an interest in Tibetan Buddhism for the most part, which seems to, have flourished in terms of like Shambhala publications, but certainly the Beat generation, and also Zen Buddhism, right? Leonard Cohen, probably one of its most famous practitioners. And yet hearing your presentation, Donald, and reading your book really lets me understand how significant not just the Lotus Sutra is in terms of the major sutras, but in terms of the history of Buddhism making its way here in the West, and yet its influence in terms of being palpably felt in the popular culture. It's nowhere near the same kind of reception, visibility as other Buddhisms and other texts. So I don't know if you'd like to speak to that, Donald, if that's an entry point for you or for anybody.
Sure, there's a lot to say about that, and I think you're quite right that we see that the forms of Buddhism that are popular in America sort of come in waves. So after the Second World War, it was Zen, and we have the beat poets, as you mentioned. We have Gary Snyder, Ginsberg, Kerouac, all quite interested in Zen. That fades away a bit, and Tibetan Buddhism comes to the fore, especially after the Dalai Lama fled to India in 1959. I think one reason why the Lotus Sutra doesn't really make it into that particular canon is because of the history of colonialism. Fact that Buddhism had died out in India by the time it became a British colony. And the officers of the East India Company and then European scholars really thought that they had true Buddhism, original Buddhism in the so-called Theravada tradition that was preserved in Sri Lanka at the time and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And the Mahayana they saw as just a kind of a later fabrication, which they regarded as inauthentic. And so as Buddhism made its way to the West, primarily through India and then through England, it was really the Pali canon that was seen as true Buddhism, or as they called it, original Buddhism, primitive Buddhism. And the Mahayana was not really looked at that carefully. So it was really only when Japanese scholars began to study Sanskrit in the UK that they convinced people like Max Muller to look at the Lotus Sutra, look at the Pure Land Sutras. But that effect on the larger practice of Buddhism in the West was fairly negligible until we have Soka Gakkai coming. Yeah.
And to your point, Donald, about colonialism, I really appreciated, Jennifer, your really complex negotiation of the history of Japanese imperialism in terms of your Korean heritage, your background, but actually your understanding, your practice, your reading of the Lotus Sutra actually helped you, what you term and help you develop empathy to larger pictures. And I wonder if you could speak to the awareness of the poetry as you were reciting it and your own development as a poet, or maybe new directions in your poetry vis-a-vis negotiating this history. Because one of the things that I would like to talk about is what seems to be, based on yours and Thomas's presentations, like a mystical experience with practicing Buddhism, in the sense that poetry can be mystical when you let language take over, right? And you're reciting it. So if you could just touch on those negotiations and elaborate on it a bit.
Thanks for the question. I want to talk maybe about the materiality of Daimoku and Gongyo for a moment. I really appreciated Tom's scansion of some of the language of the Lotus Sutra. I also think too how, the way in which when you're monolingual and you're coming to a language that is so very different in terms of its syntax, its sound, but specifically you are taking on board by way of ritual through chanting, that there is a way in which that language is then settling into your body and rearranging your senses and heightening your awareness. And I think that when I was starting out as a poet during my graduate program, becoming interested in Korean poetry and translation, while at the same time developing a practice in Soka Gakkai Buddhism, that there was a way in which this Daimoku and learning Gongyo in particular began to completely disorient the way I. What I mean by that is specifically the fact that with Gongyo, and I don't think this is unusual, especially before the internet became a part of everyday life, I didn't always understand the words that I was saying. I was learning this Gongyo, and there was a way in which this language was beginning to work on me in ways that, again, were were changing zones in my mouth to where I was beginning to feel English sort of drop off. And I think the realization that, I'm not living in this kind of linear world whereby Korea is a dead past, but at the exact same time, at the exact same moment, there are relatives who are speaking in a language that I can't directly access. Again, remembering that back then, internet was just not what it is right now, was completely revelatory to me and to my poetic praxis. I think, too, the image of the two Buddhas, of recognizing that this expedient means also privileges multiple ways in which the Buddha has had a presence, that it's not just, the lifespan of 40 years, that one story of the Buddha's life is not the overall story, that there is instead a kind of manifold way in which multiple presences of the Buddha exists. I think it was that image that really opened up for me this idea of simultaneity, and that it's through language, through the poem as a kind of space where I can bend time and resist some idea of parents, relatives in Korea being dead, that those parts of myself were also deadened. I could resist that whole idea of where, these so-called dead pasts are the waste of Korea entering modernity. I could refuse all of that by way of moving into these images that I was so humbled and thankful that the Lotus Sutra, when coming into my life, opened up for me. And I think it was that process of my imagination letting go of these conventions I'd received through English language, the ways in which my education had been a part of a kind of monolingual inheritance that was so revelatory to me, and I have such deep gratitude for.
And Tom, you were speaking to reciting the Lotus Sutra in the original, not original, but the Japanese text. And as I understand it, you don't speak Japanese, but it seems unique to me. I grew up Catholic, and so the prayers that I would utter are in Catholic American English, right? So, which is to say that I actually understand the words as I'm hearing them, and presumably you've been chanting for many years, so you understand the Japanese that you're reciting. But it makes me really think about how your chanting really then is immersed in the poetry, in the meter, but also the sound of the words in carrying you through. And maybe you could speak more on this, elaborate more on the fact that you are reciting this in a language that you don't necessarily speak, and what the poetry of that is like for you.
Well, though I started practicing in 1974, the first time I visited the head temple of my sect, Nichiren Shoshu, was 1991, and that year I started to learn some Japanese. So I would say for the first 17 years of the 46, I really didn't know, I didn't really have a sense of Japanese. Of course, Kumarajiva's translation that we recite in Nichiren Shoshu is not Japanese, but it's Japanese, I believe Japanese pronunciation, differing from Chinese. So I would say at this point, when I recite the sutra in the morning and evening, the two chapters, there are characters that I do understand in terms of English translation. I don't know, maybe 30%. is really sufficient for me to encourage me to practice strongly. And I would say the rhythm of the prose section of the 16th chapter, the lifespan chapter, even the rhythm of the prose section probably in some way could be scanned. I didn't try for this occasion, but there is a particular rhythm in the prose sections of the two chapters that have a powerful incantatory effect.
Yeah, I have to say, just going back to your mention, Donald, about colonialism, I was talking to a friend of mine who's also Asian American and mentioned, hey, I'm doing a program on poetry and spirituality focusing on Buddhism and on the Lotus Sutra. And this poet friend of mine, skeptical, said, is it, going to be paneled by white Buddhists, right? And that really speaks to, right, a concern that I also certainly share in terms of the Orientalism in the West, the appreciation of Buddhism and the intersection of commerce and capital, right? It'll probably be for another program or an aside when I talk to you about my own experiences of being white-splained about Buddhism, right? Folks feeling they're Asian because of their interest in it. But to get back to why this particular sutra has not penetrated American consciousness like other sutras or other texts or other Buddhisms, I wonder if it has to do with this Orientalist idea of the East can be known, and in other sutras, perhaps the teaching of the Buddha is more apparent, whereas in the Lotus Sutra, as you brilliantly explained, Donald, perhaps the teaching of the Lotus Sutra is the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and that even though it's called a sutra, it doesn't proceed in the way that one would expect a sutra to proceed. Although you clearly, Jennifer and Tom, have encountered tremendous wisdom by reciting it, right? So could we maybe talk about that? Donald, maybe we could return to this point and elaborate on it.
Yeah, it's a very profound text, and its profundity is not immediately apparent just by reading. And I think certainly for the scholar of Buddhism, what is so powerful about it is its radical critique of the earlier tradition, in which the Buddha himself, in a sense, repudiates his own teaching, the teaching that we all sort of learn in Introduction to Buddhism, and which was the Buddhism that was taught by the British in the colonial period. To have all of that sort of upended and reinterpreted in a very radical way, I think that profundity is not something that comes across unless you understand the milieu from which it appeared, both in India and then its influence elsewhere. I mean, one of the things we have to think about when we think about the history of Buddhism is that the tradition developed over time. And we know, looking at India, we can give some sort of a sequence of which texts appeared when. But then when Buddhism spread north to China, it was just a monk taking a book on the back of a camel. That is, the Chinese didn't know this sort of sequence of things. And so to get a work like the Lotus Sutra, which explains everything, it says, don't worry about these three vehicles, don't worry about those complications. Here is something new, and this is what I really meant, and this is my final teaching. That's extremely powerful to a Buddhist tradition. But if you don't know that tradition already, the power of that message is not immediately apparent.
If I may, I just wanted to read from the biography towards the end of your book, Donald. The endless self-praise of the Lotus Sutra might only be reasonably explained should a reasonable explanation be possible by considering that a Lotus Sutra, like the earlier Buddhist sutras that it rejects, began not as something that was read, but as something that was recited, not as text, but as word. And as you also pointed out earlier, that it's a series of accretions throughout the book. And as I would read the Lotus Sutra and compare it to the Heart Sutra and Diamond Sutra, it's so unique in terms of its poetics, right? contradictory for sure, but in terms of Nichiren Daishonin, Tom, one of the sections of the sutras that's encountered in your recitation, those two parts to your prayer, the understanding is between two Buddhas, right? So the non-understanding being so key to experiencing the wisdom of the sutra that we're all kind of predisposed to believing will teach us something upon reading it. I mean, that just like disorients the Orientalist, right? And I wonder if that might also have to do with, its lack of popularity, and that it calls for, a practice for you to really experience it. Your understanding is in not reading it semantically, but uttering it out loud. And Jennifer, that's something that I take away from your presentation.
Yeah, I think there's something about the oracular quality by which one interacts with the Lotus Sutra, so that one is interacting, well, speaking only for myself for a moment, interacting with the text as a reader who's committed the work through oral community, who's committed the work not only to memory, but really to body memory. I think that's an incredible physical relationship with the text that I think is really unique. I'm also struck by your earlier question to Donald about the role of the Lotus Sutra with colonialism. And, granted, I don't know as much about this topic as Donald does, and I would completely defer to him here. But what really struck me as I was learning more about the history of Soka Gakkai, about Korean Buddhism, about also just my own family's history, what really struck me was the way in which the Lotus Sutra seems so much at the center of all of those different threads, and how the Lotus Sutra has been used in different moments through our history to promote ideas of nationalism at times, other ideas of sort of wanting to get to a purity of the text, when the text itself has all these interesting complications around being a text formed out of accretion, maybe out of others writing comments in response to earlier parts of the text. I think rather than all of that complexity being a downside, I think it's actually very fascinating and makes the text incredibly vibrant and dynamic. So I wonder, when I think about what I've learned from the Lotus Sutra when it comes to my own poetic praxis, when I think about matters of form and genre, I find myself sort of pausing and thinking about the Lotus Sutra overall as this really complicated text where I don't know if I could even call it an anthology. What is the genre of the Lotus Sutra? If that's a helpful question.
Yeah, if I may share,
Yeah.
I remember a conversation. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Donald.
I was just going to say that's a huge question. What is the genre? And as Paolo had mentioned, we all, as readers of the text, we keep asking ourselves, where is the Lotus Sutra? Where does it begin? Because when the jeweled stupa emerges from the earth in chapter 11, the Buddha says, now I'm about to teach the Lotus Sutra, and we're in chapter 11. And so that question is always something that we're trying to answer, and the answer is always evading us. And I think that's part of the attraction and power of the text.
What I was going to say was that my godmother had shared with me back in the 90s. I think I'm dating myself here, but she had shared with me that when about 10 years prior to this conversation, that someone had introduced the Lotus Sutra to her and had introduced Nichiren Shoshu to her, and she tried it. By trying, she actually started chanting, and she was at that point practicing Catholic. Her Virgin Mary statue broke in half. And this is a godmother who's had a lot of supernatural experiences and has the third eye. But what she took from that was she was being punished by, you know, her Catholic upbringing, and it actually scared her. But probably there's something more mundane, like she probably tripped on it while she was chanting, you know, and it fell over, toppled, or it was an old statue. Whatever the case, the power of reciting the Daimoku that you offered, Tom, for my godmother was revelatory without even understanding, which is, if you look at it from a poetry's perspective, that's the poetry, that's the meter of the language, right? That's the structure. She doesn't remember which particular part of the sutra she read, but she said that she was really into it and she was chanting with all of her might. And then this happened. And for me, the takeaway from that as a poet is really the power of poetry, and perhaps also given that most of the world's sacred texts are composed in verse, perhaps that's also why so many people are afraid of poetry, because there's such a, you know, understanding that if you're reading poetry, you must understand. And yet here we have this, to my mind, it's a mind-blowing sutra that no, it's not really so much about understanding, right? Like, you know, you experience it as much as you try to wrap your head around it. And this notion of, I'm going to teach this to you now, but you keep reading it and you read for it and it doesn't necessarily happen, right? Which for me seems very truthful to poetry, right? That's how one experiences poetry. I don't know if any folks would want to speak to that aspect, you know, the decentering of language, experience with language, where it's not just a semantic, it's the other aspects of it that carry you forward in your experience of the holy.
If I can go back to to what Donald was saying about where the Lotus Sutra starts, my understanding from the writings of Tiantai and Nichiren Tiantai of China and Nichiren Daishonin is that the Lotus Sutra is divided into preparation, transmission, and entrustment. And therefore, prior to chapter 11, there is preparation for the transmission, which happens in the treasure tower. So that's my understanding of it.
Yes, that's Jury's interpretation, and certainly that's been very influential, but it's something that we don't see the Indian text at all. And so we have to, I think it's the very conundrum of where the Lotus Sutra starts that leads to that particular description that we find in Tiantai. Yeah.
Donald, I have a question for you as a professor, teacher, educator of Buddhist studies, and you teach this text. And we are in what, you know, everyone now is understanding as the Anthropocene, right? Poetics has never been more immediate to the teaching of poetry, right? The environment collapsing around us. And as I understand in your book, I mean, the Lotus Sutra does speak to the present, right? Like it's an eternal struggle that it speaks to, but somehow finds a way to always bring it to a discussion of the now. How has the reception of your students today, undergraduates or graduates, been to their discovery of the sacred text? And is there any connection to what's been happening politically, social-politically, globally?
I'm actually just doing that this week, so I can't tell you what the response is going to be. We're on the Lotus Sutra this week in my Intro to Buddhism class. But in the past, students have actually objected to it because they become so attached to the earlier tradition. They're so moved by the story of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, the basic Buddhism that we all learned, that they find this disruption of that to be very disquieting. And I try to get them to sort of inhabit that disquiet and to try to understand the power of the text, that this is the way that innovation occurs in Buddhism, through taking the vocabulary of the text and creating a new language. But I have to say, we're still in the middle of the semester, so I can't give you the answer for 2020.
And Jennifer, Tom, have you encountered any opportunity in your own literature classes to talk about Buddhism or maybe introduce the Lotus Sutra as a poetic text?
the Lotus Sutra per se, no, but a literary text that is informed by ideas in the Lotus Sutra, I will reference it. Or if there are texts, whether Eastern or Western, that, or if students sort of casually talk about things like karma, or any kind of Buddhist doctrine, then I might reference the Lotus Sutra. But no, I haven't taught any excerpts from Lotus Sutra. I don't think I feel that I'd be qualified to do so.
So I've taught about poetry as a kind of ritual form. I'm thinking about the work of Denise Levertov in particular, where she, in her essays, has described form as a kind of enactment of a spiritual attention. So I've had my students read selections of Levertov's essays, read some of her poems, thinking specifically related to the Lotus Sutra, that I haven't taught excerpts from the text. I think, similar to Tom, I don't feel that I'm qualified in the depth of my reading to be able to provide a context for the students to come into the Lotus Sutra. I realized that I would need to be able to speak to them more about how the text has traveled. But what I think that my students are maybe encountering through their reading of Norman Dubie and his work, specifically, he's not treating the Lotus Sutra. His work is more tied to Tibetan Buddhism. But still, there's a way in which, in Dubie's work, also in Levertov, I would argue, there's an understanding of lyrical time as not being just this self-contained moment, but rather that there are simultaneous planes of experience. The way in which Norman Dubie in particular bends the lyric and creates these ways in which histories are layered in a kind of multiverse, I think is very fascinating. And I love how his work really pushes students out of their received notions of what a lyric can do. So I would say that while I'm not teaching the Lotus Sutra directly, there are ways in which, in my pedagogy, I'm pushing against some of the received ideas of a poem as a spontaneous overflow of emotions, where one is recollecting a memory and tranquility, this kind of romanticism that sometimes students really hold on to and maybe have trouble pushing up against, to really experiment and enjoy the materiality of a poem's structure and possibility.
And certainly, Donald, when you write in your book that the Lotus Sutra somehow speaks to eternity and the present now, the grasp of time and timelessness seems so immediate in the Lotus Sutra, certainly in terms of the form itself, right? The interplay, but then the reference to the Buddhas in the past, that this revelation that Shakyamuni has been around for a long, long time. And so I can see your students or any reader interested in earlier teachings of Shakyamuni to be completely overwhelmed by reading the Lotus Sutra. No pressure on you though, but is there any reading that you can bring to this moment that you see in the sacred text?
You mean a passage or a point?
A point, given, your observation that, somehow the Lotus Sutra speaks to eternity, but also always to the present moment or the present struggle.
Right.
Is there perhaps something about this moment that we're in, that you're encountering this Lotus Sutra that,
Maybe not so much about this moment, but just to say that all statements about the eternal are made in time. All statements about the timeless are made in time. And so one of the things that I think is so powerful about the Lotus Sutra is that, at least from the point of view of the scholar, it was not spoken by the Buddha. And that in itself, I think, is a moment of inspiration. That it's a violation of the Bodhisattva vow to say that the Buddha did not teach the Mahayana Sutras. That means that in India, there were many people who said that they were not the word of the Buddha. And yet we find these brilliant monks and nuns who know the tradition so well and are willing to make this radical reinterpretation of the tradition in a way that turns out to be timeless. And the timelessness is not the timelessness that's found in the Pure Land of Amitabha and in some Pure Land far away from our world. It's a Pure Land that exists on Vulture Peak, where the Buddha is forever teaching the Lotus Sutra.
Great answer. Thank you so much. And as ever, this is a conversation that can only be an initial one. But I am really thinking about the moment when Burnouf brought the Lotus Sutra to the West, the European participation in this trajectory, but also the publication in the Dial that it was Nathaniel Hawthorne's sister-in-law who translated it, and the connection to Emerson, and then of course Transcendentalism, which makes me think about Whitman and think about this moment that we're in, right? But that will have to be for another conversation. Just really quickly, could you individually let our viewers know what you're up to, what we can look forward to?
First, I'd like to say that for our time, the Lotus Sutra talks about the absolute equality of enlightenment of all beings. And I think that's a very important message for our time. These are my two recent books, if you can see them. And I'm working on, I'm on sabbatical right now from my job, and I'm working on a book about teaching poetry to college students.
How about you, Jennifer?
I'm currently in the middle of a translation project with my colleague Johanna Domokos, and she and I are co-translating Underfoot, which is the tentative title that we've landed upon, which is a work by Niels Holmberg, who is a Sami poet and also finalist for the Nordic Council Prize. So that project is currently in the works. I'm also in the middle of editing the next issue of Agni, and a special folio that I'm delighted to be co-editing with my colleague Shuchi Saraswat, who's also a member of the Agni masthead. We are looking at this theme of futures. We are aiming to get a snapshot through a selection of translated work, poetry, prose around the world, about how we are all just collectively pondering future, like what is a possible future, given the moment that we are in with Anthropocene, with the ways in which the Amazon is burning, California is burning. We seem to be in a moment that is a kind of interregnum, and how are we collectively and as represented through translation, all pondering what futures might look like? How is that affecting our imagination? So look for that issue coming out in Agni, most likely in fall 2022.
And Donald?
Yeah, so in 2008, when Yankee Stadium was being demolished, they discovered a scroll, which was taken to New York Public Library, and it turned out to be a Sanskrit manuscript whose title would be translated roughly as the Baseball Sutra. So I've translated that into English, and I published it in a book called Buddha Takes the Mound, Enlightenment in 9 Innings, which proves that the Buddha invented baseball to teach us about suffering.
And that book cover color scheme matches my background right now. And I have to say, I'm a Mets fan, so I understand to a certain extent, but I have my, intentional limitations. Thank you all so much for this. I hope to have you each back, and be safe and be well. And until next time, I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And for all our viewers, as ever, be well, be safe. Let's Look out for each other. Please wear a mask. And until next time, I'm Paulo Javier, Poets House. See you soon.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.